After years of silence, the veteran rancher heard tribal singing. 5 native girls stood by his fence. The sound came at dawn, threading through the morning mist like something from another world. Samuel Harrison dropped his coffee cup, the ceramic shattering against the porch steps as 47 years of silence shattered with it. The voices rose and fell in harmonies that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the earth itself, haunting melodies that made his weathered hands tremble. 5 young women stood at his fence line, their long black hair catching the early light as they sang in a language that Samuel had not heard since he was a young man. Their voices wove together like streams converging into a river, each note carrying weight and meaning that reached deep into places he had forgotten existed. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, painted in shades of pink and gold that reminded Samuel of mornings from his childhood, when the world had seemed full of possibility and his father's ranch had been just another piece of land rather than a fortress of solitude. The Beartooth Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with snow, even in late summer, standing as silent witnesses to the scene unfolding in the valley below. Samuel stood frozen on his porch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The women continued their song, their voices carrying across the pasture where his cattle grazed peacefully, as if the animals understood something he had spent decades trying to forget. The melody was achingly beautiful, filled with longing and loss and something else he couldn't name. He recognized the tune. God help him, he recognized it. It was a mourning song, a lament for the dead that the Crow people had sung at his wife's funeral 47 years ago. The same song that had driven him to build higher fences, to post warning signs, to turn his back on the world and the memories it contained. The same song that had haunted his dreams until he had learned to stop dreaming altogether. The youngest of the women, perhaps no more than 16, lifted her voice in a solo that soared above the others like an eagle catching the wind. Her words were in Crow, but Samuel understood their meaning in his bones. She was singing about Morning Star, about the woman who had bridged 2 worlds and left too soon, about the love that had been lost and the silence that had followed. Morning Star, his wife's name, translated into the language of her people, the name he had not spoken aloud in 4 decades. Samuel's legs gave out, and he sank into the wooden chair on his porch, his calloused hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. The song continued, washing over him like a tide, carrying him back to a time when the world had been different, when he had been different, when love had been stronger than fear. He had been 25 then, fresh from the war and full of anger at a world that had taken his friends and left him alive when better men had died. He had come to Montana to forget, to lose himself in the hard work of building something from nothing. The ranch had been a homestead claim then, just a cabin and a few acres of grassland that seemed to stretch to the edge of forever. Morning Star had been 17, the daughter of a Crow chief who had seen something in the young veteran that Samuel himself had not yet recognized. She had appeared at his fence line one morning, much as these women had, carrying water and speaking softly to his horses in her musical language. She had been beautiful in the way wildflowers were beautiful, natural, and untamed, and absolutely perfect. The courtship had been complicated by language barriers and cultural differences, but love had found a way. Morning Star had learned English with surprising speed, and Samuel had struggled to master enough Crow to communicate with her family. They had married in a ceremony that honored both traditions, with her people's songs echoing across the valley, and his few white neighbors looking on with mixtures of curiosity and disapproval. For 3 years, they had been happy. Morning Star had filled the empty spaces in Samuel's heart with laughter and wisdom, and a kind of peace he had never known was possible. She had taught him to read the signs in the wind and the behavior of animals, to understand the language of the land itself. In return, he had shown her the world of cattle ranching and business, the practicalities of surviving in a territory that was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The baby had been born in the spring of their 3rd year together, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. They had named her Little Bird, and for 2 perfect months, Samuel had believed that happiness was possible, that the past could be forgotten and the future could be bright. Then the fever had come. It had started with the baby, a sickness that seemed to steal her breath and dim the light in her eyes. Morning Star had fought for their daughter with every remedy she knew, calling on the medicine women of her tribe and the few white doctors who would come to treat an Indian woman's child. But the fever had been stronger than their love, stronger than their hope, and little Bird had died on a morning when the sky was the color of fresh blood. Morning Star had lasted only 3 days longer, succumbing to the same sickness that had taken their daughter. Samuel had held her hand as she died, listening to her whisper prayers in Crow, feeling his heart break with each labored breath. Her people had come for the funeral, filling the valley with their songs and their grief, honoring a woman who had tried to build bridges between two worlds. After they had gone, Samuel had built his fences higher and his heart harder. He had posted signs warning trespassers to stay away, had fired his ranch hands and learned to work alone, had trained himself to forget the sound of crow voices singing in the morning light. For 47 years, he had succeeded in keeping the world at bay, turning his ranch into an island of silence in a territory that had grown and changed around him. Now these 5 women stood at his fence, their voices reaching across the decades to touch wounds he had thought were healed. The song was ending, the harmonies fading like echoes in a canyon, but the silence that followed was different from the silence he had cultivated. This silence was full of possibility, heavy with meaning, pregnant with the promise of change. The woman who had sung the solo stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate. She was young, perhaps the same age Morning Star had been when they first met, but her eyes held wisdom that spoke of old souls and ancient knowledge. She wore traditional clothing, mixed with modern elements, a buckskin dress decorated with beadwork over blue jeans and worn boots. "Samuel Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality as her singing. "I am Laughing Fox, granddaughter of Chief Iron Bull, great-granddaughter of the woman who called you son." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He remembered Chief Iron Bull, Morning Star's father, who had welcomed him into the tribe with ceremony and celebration. The old chief had died years ago, but Samuel had heard nothing of his family, had cut himself off from any news of the people who had once been his people. "You remember my grandmother," Laughing Fox continued. "She was called Walking Woman, and she held your hand when Morning Star crossed over to the spirit world." The memories came flooding back, unstoppable now that the dam had been breached. Walking Woman, the medicine woman who had tried to save his wife and daughter, who had sung the death songs and prepared the bodies for burial. She had been kind to him in his grief, had tried to comfort him in his own language, had invited him to remain with the tribe when the funeral was over. He had refused, unable to bear the constant reminders of what he had lost. He had thanked her for her kindness and returned to his ranch, building walls both physical and emotional to keep the pain at bay. He had thought it was the right choice, the only choice, but now he wondered if he had been wrong. "Is she—" Samuel began, then stopped, unable to finish the question. "She crossed over last winter," Laughing Fox said gently. "But before she died, she told us about the white man who had loved Morning Star, who had grieved so deeply that he forgot how to live. She made us promise to come to you when the time was right, to bring you the song that would help you remember." Samuel closed his eyes, feeling tears he had not shed in decades threatening to spill over. "I remember everything," he said quietly. "That's the problem." "Memory is not a problem," said another of the women, stepping forward to join Laughing Fox. She was older, perhaps in her 30s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. "I am Bright Eyes, daughter of Walking Woman. Memory is a gift, a way of keeping the dead alive in the world of the living." The other 3 women introduced themselves in turn. There was Singing Bird, who looked to be about 25 and wore her hair in traditional braids decorated with feathers. Next came Dancing Cloud, a few years younger, whose smile reminded Samuel painfully of Morning Star's infectious joy. The youngest was called Whispering Wind, and she was the one who had sung the solo, her voice pure and clear as mountain water. "Why now?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why after all these years?" Laughing Fox glanced at her companions before answering. "Because the silence has gone on long enough. Because Morning Star's spirit is restless, separated from the man who loved her by walls of his own making. Because there are things that need to be said, wounds that need to be healed, connections that need to be restored." Samuel looked at the 5 women standing at his fence, at the faces that reflected the features of people he had once known and loved. They were beautiful in the way Morning Star had been beautiful, natural and proud, and completely themselves. They carried themselves with the confidence of people who knew their place in the world, who understood their connection to the land and the generations that had come before them. "I don't know how to let people in anymore," he said, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I've been alone for so long, I don't remember how to be anything else." "Then we will teach you," Whispering Wind said, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "The way Morning Star taught you to understand the language of the wind, the way your love taught her to see the world through different eyes." The sun was fully up now, painting the pasture in shades of gold and green. Samuel's cattle had wandered closer to the fence, drawn by the sound of voices and the promise of company. His prize bull, a massive Angus named Thunder, stood just a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed on the women with what looked like approval. "Your animals remember us," Bright Eyes observed, reaching out to touch Thunder's broad forehead. The bull allowed the contact, even leaning into her hand in a way that made Samuel's heart skip. "They remember the time when this land was shared, when the barriers between worlds were not so high." Samuel stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement after sitting in the same position for so long. He walked to the edge of his porch, close enough to the fence to see the details of the women's faces, to smell the sweetgrass and sage that clung to their clothing. "What do you want from me?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We want you to remember who you were before the silence," Laughing Fox said. "We want you to honor the love you shared with Morning Star by living instead of just surviving. We want you to be part of the world again, part of the community that still remembers your name." Samuel looked at each of the women in turn, seeing in their faces the echo of people he had known and loved. They were offering him something he had thought was lost forever, a chance to be connected to something larger than his own grief and isolation. "I'm 72 years old," he said. "I'm set in my ways. I don't know if I can change." "Change is not about age," Dancing Cloud said, her voice warm with understanding. "Change is about choosing life over death, connection over isolation, love over fear. You have already taken the first step by listening to our song, by allowing us to speak to you instead of ordering us away." Samuel realized she was right. The man who had built these fences and posted these signs would have shouted at the women to leave, would have called the sheriff if necessary to maintain his precious isolation. But he had listened to their song, had let their voices carry him back to a time when the world had been full of possibility. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Come to the reservation," Whispering Wind said. "Come to the ceremony we are holding to honor Walking Woman's memory. Let us show you that you are not forgotten, that your love for Morning Star is still remembered and celebrated by her people." The thought of leaving the ranch, of being around people again, after so many years of solitude, filled Samuel with a fear that was almost physical. But beneath the fear was something else, a longing he had buried so deep he had forgotten it existed. "I wouldn't know what to say," he said. "I wouldn't know how to act." "You will know," Bright Eyes said with quiet confidence. "The heart remembers what the mind forgets. You will find your way back to the man you used to be, the man who was brave enough to love across the boundaries of culture and race." Samuel looked at his ranch, at the land he had worked for nearly 5 decades, at the fences that had kept the world at bay. It was a good ranch, productive and well-maintained, but it was also a prison of his own making. He had built it to protect himself from pain, but in doing so, he had also protected himself from joy. "The ceremony is tomorrow night," Laughing Fox said. "We will come for you at sunset if you wish to attend." Samuel nodded slowly, surprising himself with the decision. "I'll be ready." The women smiled, and for a moment, Samuel could see Morning Star in their faces, could feel her presence in the way they moved and spoke. The connection was not broken, he realized. It had only been buried under years of grief and silence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "There is one more thing," Singing Bird said, reaching into a leather bag she carried. She withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth, holding it out to Samuel with reverence. "Walking Woman wanted you to have this." Samuel accepted the bundle with trembling hands, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a piece of carved bone, intricately decorated with symbols he recognized from Morning Star's jewelry. It was a hair ornament, something that had belonged to his wife, something he had not seen since the day she died. She kept it all these years, Bright Eyes explained. She said it belonged with the man who had loved its owner, who had honored her memory even in his silence. Samuel held the ornament up to the light, seeing in its polished surface the reflection of the man he had been, the man he might still become. It was a bridge between past and present, between grief and hope, between the silence he had cultivated and the voice he might yet find. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of wind through grass. The women began to move away from the fence, their task completed, their message delivered. But as they walked toward the road, Whispering Wind turned back, her young face serious and hopeful. "Samuel Harrison," she called. "Morning Star's spirit is not lost. She lives in the wind that blows across your pasture, in the songs we sing, in the love that refuses to die. Tomorrow night, you will hear her voice again, and you will remember what it means to be truly alive." After they had gone, Samuel stood alone on his porch, the bone ornament clutched in his weathered hands. The silence that had been his companion for so many years felt different now, not empty, but full of possibility. He could hear the wind in the grass, the lowing of cattle, the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the mountains. For the first time in 47 years, Samuel Harrison began to plan for tomorrow. He would need to find clothes suitable for a ceremony, would need to remember how to be around people, would need to find the courage to step outside the walls he had built around his heart. But the women had been right about one thing. The heart remembered what the mind forgot. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Samuel went inside his house and began to prepare for the journey back to the world of the living. The silence was ending, and with it, the long night of his exile from joy. Morning Star's song would be heard again, and this time he would be ready to listen. The ranch that had been his fortress would remain, but it would no longer be a prison. It would be a place of memory and hope, a bridge between the man he had been and the man he might yet become. The fences would stay, but they would no longer keep the world at bay. Instead, they would mark the boundaries of a heart that had learned to love again, a life that had chosen connection over isolation, song over silence. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the endless cycle of grief and healing, loss and redemption. And somewhere in the wind that blew across the grassland, Morning Star's voice could be heard, calling her husband home to the community of the living, to the celebration of love that transcends death itself. Samuel spent the rest of that day in a strange state of suspended animation, moving through his familiar routines while his mind wrestled with decades of buried memories. He fed the cattle, checked the water troughs, and mended a section of fence that had been damaged by the recent storms. But his hands worked without conscious direction, guided by muscle memory, while his thoughts traveled back through time. He found himself standing in the barn where Morning Star had once milked their small herd of dairy cows, her voice humming crow melodies that made the animals calm and cooperative. She had possessed an almost magical ability to communicate with all living things, reading the moods of horses and cattle with an intuition that had amazed him. The barn still smelled faintly of hay and leather, but the music was gone, replaced by the silence he had cultivated like a bitter crop. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Samuel stood before the mirror in his bedroom and tried to remember how to prepare for company. His reflection showed a man weathered by years of solitude, his hair white as winter snow, his face lined with the accumulated weight of unspoken grief. He had not dressed for a social occasion in 4 decades, had not cared about his appearance beyond basic cleanliness and functionality. The clothes in his closet told the story of his isolation. Work shirts and jeans, heavy coats for winter, a single black suit that he had worn to funerals but nothing else. He pulled out the suit, surprised to find that it still fit his lean frame, though the style was decades out of date. It would have to do. Morning Star had always said that respect was shown through effort, not fashion. As he struggled with the tie, his fingers remembering the motions from a lifetime ago, Samuel found himself thinking about the ceremony he would attend tomorrow night. He wondered what it would be like to be surrounded by people again, to hear voices speaking in the language that had once been as familiar as his own. Would they remember him with kindness? Or would his years of isolation be seen as a rejection of their friendship? The questions followed him through a restless night filled with dreams of Morning Star and their daughter. He saw them as they had been in life, vibrant and full of joy, but also as they might have been if fate had been kinder. Little Bird would have been 44 now, perhaps with children of her own, continuing the line that connected two cultures in bonds of love and understanding. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Samuel went through his routine with mechanical precision, but every familiar task felt different now, charged with the anticipation of change. The cattle sensed his restlessness, gathering near the fence as if expecting something unusual to happen. Thunder, his prize bull, stood closer to the house than usual. His massive head turned toward the road as if he too were waiting for visitors. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Samuel found himself checking the clock repeatedly, counting the hours until sunset when the women would return for him. He tried to read, tried to work on his account books, tried to plan for the coming winter, but nothing could hold his attention for more than a few minutes at a time. In the late afternoon, he walked the perimeter of his property, following the fence line that marked the boundaries of his world. The ranch covered nearly 1,000 acres of prime grassland, watered by 3 creeks, and protected by natural windbreaks of cottonwood and aspen. It was good land, productive land, worth a fortune by current standards. But it was also a monument to loneliness, a kingdom ruled by a man who had forgotten how to be a subject. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Samuel positioned himself on his porch, dressed in his ancient suit, and holding the bone ornament that Walking Woman had preserved for so many years. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the carved piece over and over, feeling the smooth surface that had once adorned his beloved wife's hair. They appeared at exactly sunset, just as Laughing Fox had promised. But this time, they were not alone. A pickup truck followed them down the dirt road, driven by a man Samuel did not recognize. The vehicle stopped at his gate, and the 5 women climbed out, their ceremonial clothes bright and beautiful in the fading light. Laughing Fox approached the porch with the same grace she had shown the day before, but now her expression held a mixture of hope and concern. "Are you ready, Samuel Harrison?" He nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "I think so." The man from the truck joined them, and Samuel saw that he was perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered features and strong build of someone who worked with his hands. His clothing was a mixture of traditional and modern elements, like the women's, and his bearing suggested authority tempered by kindness. "This is my uncle, Robert Iron Bull," Laughing Fox said, "son of the chief who welcomed you into our family so many years ago." Samuel extended his hand, and Robert clasped it firmly, his grip conveying strength and warmth. "I remember you," the younger man said. "I was just a boy when you married Morning Star, but I remember the ceremony, the joy on both sides. My father spoke of you often over the years, always with respect and affection." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, unexpected in their kindness. He had assumed that his withdrawal from the tribe would have been seen as an insult, a rejection of their friendship and hospitality. To learn that he had been remembered with fondness rather than bitterness was almost more than he could process. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I should have stayed in touch. I should have honored the connections that meant so much to me." Robert's smile was understanding rather than judgmental. "Grief makes us do strange things, brother. The important thing is that you are here now, ready to rejoin the family that never stopped considering you one of their own." The ride to the reservation took them through country that Samuel had not seen in decades, rolling hills and river valleys that had once been as familiar as his own pastures. The landscape had changed in some ways, with new roads and buildings marking the passage of time, but the essential character of the land remained unchanged. The mountains still rose like ancient guardians against the sky, and the grassland still rolled like a green ocean toward the horizon. As they drove, the women shared stories of their lives and families, bringing Samuel up to date on a community he had abandoned, but which had continued to grow and change without him. He learned that Laughing Fox was a teacher at the tribal school, working to preserve the Crow language and traditions for future generations. Bright Eyes was a nurse at the reservation clinic, following in her mother's footsteps as a healer. Singing Bird managed the cultural center, organizing ceremonies and maintaining the artifacts that told the story of their people. Dancing Cloud worked with the tribal council on environmental issues, fighting to protect the land and water that sustained their community. Whispering Wind, despite her youth, was already recognized as a gifted storyteller and singer, carrying forward the oral traditions that connected the present to the past. Each woman had built a life of purpose and meaning, contributing to the welfare of their people while maintaining the connections that made them part of something larger than themselves. Samuel found himself both humbled and inspired by their accomplishments, realizing how much he had missed by cutting himself off from the world. The reservation spread before them as they crested a hill, a collection of houses and buildings nestled in a valley watered by the Bighorn River. It was larger than Samuel remembered, with new construction indicating growth and prosperity. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a community bound together by shared history, culture, and commitment to one another. The ceremony was being held in a large meadow near the river, where a fire had been built, and dozens of people had gathered in a circle. Samuel could see men and women of all ages, from elders whose faces spoke of decades of wisdom, to children who ran and played at the edges of the gathering. The sound of drumming filled the air, accompanied by voices raised in songs that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. As the truck approached the gathering, Samuel felt his anxiety spike. So many people, so many faces that might or might not remember him, so many opportunities for awkwardness or misunderstanding. But Laughing Fox seemed to sense his discomfort, reaching over to touch his hand with gentle reassurance. "They are your family," she said simply. "They have been waiting for you to come home." The truck stopped at the edge of the meadow, and Samuel climbed out on unsteady legs, his dress shoes unfamiliar after decades of boots. The drumming paused as his presence was noticed, and dozens of faces turned toward him with expressions of curiosity and welcome. He recognized some of them, features that echoed people he had known in his youth, but many were strangers who knew him only through stories and memories. An elderly man approached from the center of the circle, moving slowly but with dignity intact. Samuel recognized him immediately despite the passage of years. Joseph Crow Feather, who had been Walking Woman's husband and one of the most respected medicine men of the tribe. He was ancient now, his face lined with age, but his eyes still sharp and kind. "Samuel Harrison," Joseph said, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet. "Welcome home, grandson." The word hit Samuel like a lightning bolt. Grandson. It was the term of respect and affection that the elder had used for him during his marriage to Morning Star, recognizing him as family despite the differences in their backgrounds. To hear it again after so many years of silence was almost overwhelming. Samuel walked forward on trembling legs, approaching the circle of his people with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Joseph extended his arms, and Samuel found himself embraced by the old man, held close while the crowd watched in respectful silence. "We have missed you," Joseph whispered in his ear. "The circle has been incomplete without you." As they separated, Samuel saw tears in the old man's eyes, tears that matched his own. Around them, the gathering began to stir back to life, people approaching to greet him with handshakes and embraces, with words of welcome and forgiveness that he had not dared to hope for. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her face familiar despite the years that had changed them both. "Sarah Crow Dog," she said, smiling at his obvious recognition. "I was Sarah Little Wolf when we knew each other. I was Morning Star's closest friend." Samuel remembered her clearly now, the young woman who had helped prepare his wife for their wedding, who had sung at their ceremony and mourned at their funerals. She looked older, of course, but her smile was unchanged, warm and welcoming, and utterly without judgment. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, taking his hands in hers. "Morning Star would be so happy to see you among us again." The ceremony began in earnest then, with Joseph leading the gathering in prayers and songs that honored Walking Woman's memory while celebrating her life and contributions to the community. Samuel found himself seated in the circle, surrounded by people who treated him not as a stranger, but as a returning family member who had been missed and was now welcomed home. The rituals were both familiar and strange. echoing ceremonies he had witnessed decades ago, but also reflecting changes and adaptations that had occurred during his absence. Children who had not been born when he left now participated alongside their parents and grandparents, their young voices adding to the ancient songs that connected the present to the past. As the fire burned higher and the stars emerged overhead, Samuel felt something loosening in his chest, a tightness that had been there for so long he had forgotten it was not natural. The sounds of the ceremony, the warmth of the fire, the presence of people who cared about him. It all combined to create a sense of belonging that he had not experienced since Morningstar's death. When the formal ceremonies concluded, people began to approach him individually, sharing memories and stories that helped to reconstruct the connections he had severed. He learned about births and deaths, marriages and achievements, struggles and triumphs that had shaped the community during his years of absence. A middle-aged man introduced himself as Thomas Crow Dog, Sarah's son, who bore a startling resemblance to a boy Samuel remembered playing with Little Bird during their brief time together. A young woman named Maria Iron Bull, Robert's daughter, spoke shyly about her studies at the State University, where she was working toward a degree in environmental science. Each conversation added another thread to the web of connection that was slowly being rewoven around Samuel's heart. He found himself remembering how to engage with people, how to show interest in their lives and concerns, how to be part of a community rather than an isolated individual. As the evening wound down and people began to gather their belongings, Laughing Fox approached Samuel with a proposal that took him completely by surprise. "We would like you to consider something," she said, her expression serious but hopeful. "The Cultural Center is planning an exhibition about the history of relationships between our people and the white settlers who chose to become part of our community. Your story with Morning Star would be an important part of that history." Samuel felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of his private grief being put on public display. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of attention." "Think about it," she said gently. "Not just as your story, but as Morning Star's story, too." She was proud of the love you shared, proud of the bridges you built together. Her memory deserves to be honored, and young people need to see examples of how love can transcend the boundaries that divide us. As the truck carried him back to his ranch that night, Samuel's mind was full of the faces and voices he had encountered, the warmth and acceptance he had been shown, the sense of possibility that had been awakened in his heart. The bone ornament rested in his palm, no longer a symbol of loss, but a bridge between past and future. The ranch looked different when they arrived, no longer a fortress, but simply a home, a place where a man lived and worked and prepared for whatever came next. The fences were still there, still marking the boundaries of his property, but they no longer seemed like walls designed to keep the world at bay. "Thank you," he said to his companions as he climbed out of the truck. "For everything. For not giving up on me." "Family doesn't give up on family," Robert said simply. "We'll see you again soon." As the truck disappeared into the darkness, Samuel stood in his yard and looked up at the stars that had witnessed his long night of exile and his first tentative steps back toward the world of the living. The silence that surrounded him now was different from the silence he had cultivated, filled with possibility rather than emptiness, pregnant with the promise of connection rather than the certainty of isolation. Samuel Harrison had spent 47 years in silence, but tonight he had remembered how to sing, and tomorrow he would begin the long journey back to the man he had been before grief had convinced him that love was too dangerous to risk again. The fences would remain, but they would no longer define the boundaries of his heart. Morning Star's song would be heard again, and this time he would be ready not just to listen, but to join his voice to the eternal chorus of love that transcends death itself.